Welcome to the first episode of Frameworks. This podcast exists because I believe coaching is more than a job. It is actually a pursuit. In this first episode, I'm laying the foundation for what this show is about and what I've spent the last 20 plus years learning, testing, and living inside of the world of coaching. We'll talk about why frameworks matter, why every great coach eventually reaches a point where tips and tactics eventually stop working, and that systems just have to take over. In this episode, we're going to cover a bunch of ground, i.e. the difference between principles and frameworks and why you need both, what happens when coaching lacks structure, how clear frameworks can reduce emotional fatigue and decision paralysis, and how the idea of thinking frameworks has changed the way that a lot of coaches I know live, lead, and coach. If you're a coach who's tired of winging it, chasing hacks, or trying to do it all on intuition, this one is absolutely for you. I'm grateful to start this journey with you, and let's get into it with episode 1 of Frameworks. All right, before we get started, let's take a second and identify terms that we're going to use on this show. Okay, so I use a lot of terms like frameworks and systems and foundations and many, many more terms. But I think it's really important that we take a second and we actually ensure that we're speaking the same language. So let's start with frameworks. That's the entire intention of this show, and it's in the title. So what is a framework? So a framework is nothing more than a system, okay? It's a system that's built on a foundation of principles. So we'll get into specifics around specific frameworks and systems later on, but to give you a tangible example that I think that you would resonate with is thinking about energy systems progressions, or more specifically for this example, let's think about aerobic progression. So for you guys that have gone through the OPEX CCP, you know that we go through MAP progression. So we go MAP 10 to 1. Okay. So let's break that down. Okay. So there's principles or truths behind that system or framework. So those principles and truths are things like we need to go long to short. We need to understand and learn our gears. We need to give our body enough time to lead to some kind of physiological adaptation from the aerobic work that we're performing. That's heart, that's lungs, that's muscle, and that's brain and emotion as well. Okay, so those are principles. Now, when we take the framework, just think of that EST chart, that energy systems training chart, and think about pulling up the MAP progression that we always use when we design training programs to keep us in line, right? That's a framework. So that's MAP 10, 9, 8, all the way to 1. And then there's rest times, there's work times, there's percentages of effort, so on and so forth. So that's an example of a framework that is built on a system, or a framework that's built on principles. Now let's talk about this idea of foundation. So I use the word foundation a lot. So let's think about foundations as being truths. Okay, so a foundation is a truth or what we have evidence to be true. Okay, so our frameworks are built on this foundation, hence the term foundation. So we have these truths, and then we build systems and we build frameworks on top of these truths. Think back to the EST example, right? We talked about the principles and the truths, and then we built our own framework on top of it. It doesn't mean that that's the only framework. It absolutely isn't the only framework. There's some great aerobic progression frameworks out there that are independent of OPEX. That's just the one that we built. Okay, so we can build our own systems and frameworks on truths, and those systems and frameworks can be different, but they cannot be counter to one another, if that makes sense, right? So you can't have two truths that are saying something completely different and they're both true. Okay, so that's a foundation. Let me give you an example of something that is a foundation and us building a framework on top of that. Okay, so we talked about program design already, but let's look at relationships with clients. Okay, so we know that at the foundation, building strong relationships is vital. Okay, that is a principle, and we can go and we can pull up a bunch of white papers talking about how having good relationships with people builds trust, right? So on and so forth. So we do know that building strong relationships is a good thing. And now we just build frameworks on how we build strong relationships. Okay, so we talk about the NEPA framework and CCP. And then you as a coach, I'm sure if you're coaching someone and let's say you're coaching them one-on-one, you might have an onboarding process. And in that onboarding process, that is the start to building that relationship. You might sit down, you might have a consultation. There's probably some questions that you have inside of that consult, and maybe you had some questions and intake prior to, and that's all set up to begin to build a relationship with that client. So that's just an example of strong relationships and having frameworks to build on those strong relationships. So coaching without frameworks leads to a ton of inconsistency. It leads to burnout, it leads to fatigue, and it leads to us reinventing the wheel over and over and over. So what is the benefit of frameworks? It's so that we can have a system to work within. Okay, so frameworks literally bring structure to our pursuit of coaching mastery. It's a much bigger conversation that we'll get into in the future, but personal purpose and our personal aim transcend all of the mini frameworks, and this is our personal foundation. Okay, so we'll get into that in a later episode, but we also have to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so we have truths, right? Then we have, truths are our foundation, right? And then we have our purpose, and then we have how we implement our own systems and frameworks, keeping in mind what are principles and what is our purpose and where are we trying to move ourselves as well as the people that we're working with. Okay, and that's why this podcast exists. This is the big idea of the entire show. It's to dig deeper. It's try to get to the foundation of everything where we can. All right, now I want to hit three main considerations or three important things to consider when building frameworks. The first thing I want to talk about is those principles again. Okay. And a colleague of mine put this really well, Sam Smith, a couple of years ago. He talked about principles kind of being like the bumpers in a bowling alley, right? And then he kind of left it there. It was like, we stay within the confines of that lane, and those principles are like the bumpers that keep us within the confines. And I just thought that was really, really good. So I've kind of carried that with me. So thanks, Sam, for that insight. But I've carried that with me over the years, and it's just so good because it's freeing, which we'll get to next. But it's freeing to understand that as long as we can work within those confines, right? We're probably fine because we're working within principles. So when we start to talk about like program design, is 6 reps better than 10 reps for strength development? If we understand principally that everyone is individual and our neuromuscular efficiency is different from one person to another, 6 and 10 might be good for, a bunch of people, or 6 versus 10 might be good for this group of people versus that group of people. But we have to work within those confines and understand that 30 isn't good. We have to understand that those bumpers going up are where we are confined. Okay. So we have to go with principles over just daily tactics. Okay. And tactics would just be the things that might fall outside of those bumpers. Okay. Tactics are everywhere, right? So we can kind of fall into that, this thing worked for this person and I saw it on social media, but it's outside of the confines of principles and we don't have the context needed to understand why it worked. So if we get too connected to those things, we might just be doing tactics, right? We might just be spinning our wheels. Okay. So without those principles, the frameworks that we build become rigid or hollow. Okay. And what I mean by that is they might work for an amount of time, but then they just stop working, right? Because they weren't built on principles. They might just work for a low percentage of the population, but not most of the population. The second thing I want to hit on is this idea of frameworks creating freedom. Okay. So the idea isn't to have a super rigid system. Okay. System does not equal rigidity. Okay. A system just equals how I go about things. Okay. How I go about things. And a system doesn't always need to be dogmatic, but there's a place for dogma. Okay. A system does not always need to be dogmatic. Frameworks and these systems help you coach with clarity, and they avoid us spinning our wheels. Okay. So there's a lot of freedom in not having to worry about if what you're doing is going to work generally. Okay. Implement a really good principle with someone and then start to refine that principle over time, while staying within those bumpers and understanding what do I need to do to get this person moving forward, and not backward. Okay, so there's a lot of freedom in just our minds and understanding that if we're working inside of these principles, we're generally doing the right things or we're generally on the right track, but we might have to kind of veer left or veer right a little bit to get it just right, but we're still on the right track. We're going in the right direction. Okay, these frameworks are going to remove chaos. They're going to reduce design or decision fatigue, and they give you margin to think and to lead your clients. Okay. So they just really lessen the burden. Okay. Just thinking about a personal example of a framework creating freedom for me, I can think of hundreds of them in coaching and outside of coaching. Having a framework in how I design training programs when I had a large base of clients, right? So when I was like, kind of going at a whim and just going like, maybe I'm going to design 5 here, 10 here, 15 here, and then on Sunday I'll finish the rest of the 50, right? There wasn't a lot of freedom in that, right? It was very constricting, which doesn't make sense to a lot of people because freedom might be you just do what you do when you want to do it. But that can be really constraining because you find yourself at the end of the week bogged down with no freedom, having to just like go out of the gates really hard to try to get 50 programs written, right? So there's not a lot of freedom in that. But when we create a really good framework and a system, that is freeing because we know what we're doing and we know when we're doing it, and it removes a lot of stress. The third piece that kind of connects to this is just when we don't have frameworks, we're just coaching in chaos. Okay. Everything becomes reactive. Like I just talked about, every client feels like a new invention, right? Every client is a brand new N=1. But if we have a system and frameworks in which we onboard that client, have initial conversations with that client, test and assess that client, build initial program design, build ongoing program design, reconsult with them, all of those things, the inputs are going to be a little bit different for each one of those clients, but we have a system in which we're building that. So it's very freeing and we're not coaching in chaos. Okay. And if we don't have these frameworks, our work just becomes really unsustainable emotionally, mentally, the whole nine. It just becomes unsustainable. And this is where burnout really occurs. Okay. So you lose energy when you need it most, right? When we are not coaching within a system. Okay. So again, coaching within a system, coaching within a framework is very freeing, and it keeps us in line and in lockstep with our goals, our ultimate goals. Before I started using frameworks, everything was kind of like putting out fires, right? I felt like a firefighter, right? So it was like, did I get this done on time? Did I design this training program for this client for this week? Did I check the box on this thing? Did I check the box on that thing? And this is in coaching and outside of coaching. So it's been an absolute game changer for me specifically when I really started to implement systems and frameworks in my coaching practice as well as my daily practice. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to give you an example of a framework, and I'll make it really simple. We'll just stick with the theme that we talked about earlier, and we'll talk about onboarding. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a framework of an onboarding structure, and I'm going to talk about this onboarding structure marrying well with CoachRx. I just assume that everyone listening to this or watching this podcast uses CoachRx, and if you don't, what are you doing? Okay. So let's walk through an example onboarding process. Okay. Number one, you sell your client into your product, into your service. Okay. So you're coaching someone, you're in person, and you're coaching them one-to-one. Okay. So the very first thing that you do is that you sell them into your product. After you sell them into your product, you invite them to CoachRx. Okay. And let's say that this is a day before your initial consult. You invite them into CoachRx. Because you have intake forms all set and ready to go and to be pushed to your client's app through that onboarding process, they're going to fill that out through CoachRx. Okay. So they get that welcome email to CoachRx, they get in the app, they're filling out their demographic or personal data, and then they're swiping, they're filling out their equipment list, and then they're filling out all the questions that you require for your intake form, and then they're good to go. They're off to the races. Okay. So you have this information, and then tomorrow you are sitting down for a one-to-one initial consultation with them. You have this information, you're already armed with it, you already reviewed all of their intake questions, so you have context. So you're going to sit down for a 60-minute consult. You're going to go back and forth on their goals, why they're there, what does success mean to them, what their daily practices are now, what has worked for them in the past, so on and so forth. And then you're going to talk about what your goals are for them. Okay, so you're going to kind of marry those two ideas or two things together. After that, you're going to say, okay, high five. Tomorrow we have our assessment. Okay, so you start off, you have intake, you have consult, and then you have your assessment. So you're meeting them in the facility and you're taking them through a 60-minute assessment. You're going to do body composition testing. You're going to take them through a movement screen, and you're also going to do some work capacity testing. All that stuff is in CoachRx. You're plugging it in, and that's what you're doing. Okay, you're done with the intake process already. You're already done with the consultation, and you're already done with that initial assessment to get body, move, and work data on that client. Now what? Do you go back into the office and you spend 6 hours designing the perfect 4-week training program, 8-week training program? No, not yet. Okay, what you're going to do is you're going to have a program ready for that person to go that is going to be within their capabilities, but that program is going to be really general. Right? So it's going to be varying in rep scheme. So you might have some 5s, you might have some 10s, you might have some 20s, you might have some motor control, you might have some muscle endurance, you might have some opportunities to kind of push load a little bit in those 5 or 6s. And all you're doing is you're just using this 4-week program as a follow-up assessment. They don't know this, but you're using it as a follow-up assessment. Very general program. And what you're doing is you want to understand how they respond to work that you give them. Okay, so they think they're just getting this awesome program, which the program should be awesome, but all you're doing is you're giving them an extended assessment. Okay, so at the end of that 4 weeks, now you're sitting down and you're doing your first monthly consult with them. In this monthly consult, you're breaking down noticings in that assessment that you took them through, and you're breaking down noticings in the 4 weeks of training that you've already taken them through, and you're talking about what you're going to do moving forward. What is the game plan? Okay, and then you're off to the races and you're into ongoing coaching. So that was a quick framework of how you can effectively onboard someone. Okay, initial consult. Okay, well, sales process, intake process, initial consult, and then you go through the assessment, and then you do 4 weeks of training. And I very intentionally said you're kind of just giving them that 4 weeks and kind of seeing where it goes. Because I've seen this happen so many times with myself specifically, where I'm behind a computer and just really trying to nail the first few weeks or the first program that I'm giving someone based on, honestly, not a lot of data. So what I realized over the years is that I get a lot of really good insights from an assessment standpoint and someone's ability to do work based on them actually doing work. Don't overreach. Don't give them something that they can't do. Keep it within the confines of their capabilities. But use that. How do they communicate with you through CoachRx? Do they understand general progression where it's like build from last week? Do they enjoy static progressions over 4 weeks? Maybe give them one day with a lot of variety. Do they like that variety, or does it kind of like punch them in the gut? Like, man, I need the same thing over 4 weeks. It's just a great opportunity to understand who your client is and to get to know your client. So that's my challenge for you this week, is to build a framework. Build a framework around your intake process. If your intake process is really tight and it's really solid, look at that and just look at where you have opportunities to refine it. Not from a time standpoint, okay? Let's be really careful there. Not from a time standpoint, but from an effectiveness standpoint. What is the best onboarding process and intake process for your clients? All right, so that is episode 1. So that was our introduction to frameworks. So I hope that you guys kind of have an idea of kind of where my head is in terms of systems and frameworks, and bit of an expanded explanation. So I went a little bit longer than expected, but I think that that's okay. If you're watching or listening to this, that means that you bared with me. So I appreciate that. So again, let's refine those systems. Let's refine those frameworks. And even outside of our intake process, let's just look at our frameworks within our entire coaching process, and just our frameworks and how we operate in our daily lives, and just look for opportunities to improve those. And it was awesome speaking with you guys. Let's keep the conversation going, and comments, or however you're watching or listening to this thing. And we will see you next week.